very productive talks, and I believe that the venue here on Lake Geneva added great equanimity to what was a very positive process. We have reached an agreement on a 90-day pause and substantially moved down the tariff levels. Both sides on the reciprocal tariffs will move their tariffs down 115%. We had very robust discussions. Both sides showed great respect. It was a chance for me to meet the Chinese delegation. The vice premier, I had previously had only a video call with. Ambassador Jameson was familiar with two of the other leaders on the delegation from his previous time. So there was very good personal interaction. Both countries represented their national interests very well. We concluded that we have shared interest, and we both have an interest in balanced trade.
Everybody, it is Professor Zeus. Thank you so much for coming by. I greatly appreciate it. If this is your first time coming by, go ahead and hit subscribe. I greatly appreciate it, and it helps the channel out a lot. And today we are looking at the roller coaster that is the U.S.-China trade war. And, it's really just a global economic showdown, honestly. Everybody's scrambling, but we do have some updates. This past weekend, the U.S. and China, well, I guess I should say today, U.S. and China announced a 90-day pause on, all the tariffs, slashing them by 115% each, 115% from us, 115% from them. And, it sounds like a big deal, right? But you got to think, is it a real step towards, peace and solidarity and trading, or, just a timeout? I'm going to try to break it down, look at all sides, and, figure out what this really means for the future, especially with China probably not extremely thrilled about how everything went down. But stick around, I'm going to try to, break it down as best as I can. So just a quick recap, this trade war, it started early April. President Trump, he, put 84% tariffs on Chinese imports, which he then increased to 145%. Why did he do this? He argued that China was ripping off the United States with a massive trade deficit, $295 billion in 2024. Even though he's, thrown around saying that the deficit is like $1 trillion. He also pointed to, China's role in the fentanyl crisis here in America, as well as unfair trade practices. And, China obviously didn't sit down quietly. They hit back with 125% tariffs on U.S. goods, restricted exports of critical minerals like rare earths, and even banned some U.S. agricultural imports. It was a tit for tat kind of thing. And, a lot of the global markets, they tanked, losing about $6 trillion in just 2 days. And a lot of economists, were warning about a global recession, and a lot of consumers like myself and you, we were just bracing for higher prices on everything from, iPhones to groceries. So, what really changed? We have, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He was the one talking. So this past weekend in Geneva, Switzerland, the U.S. and, Chinese officials, they agreed to a 90-day pause effective May 14th. And again, they cut tariffs on both sides, 115%, bringing U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods to 30% and China's to U.S. goods to 10%. And obviously, that's a huge drop from 105% from us to them and 125% from them to us, respectively. And, the markets loved it today. Honestly, the NASDAQ futures jumped nearly 4%, and China's yuan hit a 6-month high. And, President Trump, he's calling it a total reset in the whole U.S.-China relations. And, China's Commerce Ministry said it meets the expectations of producers and consumers. And it sounds like a win-win, right? But, let's look at it from all angles. The deals only detail, I mean, they're straightforward, but they leave a lot of questions, right? The U.S. keeps a 20% tariff tied to the fentanyl concerns, as well as a 10% baseline tariff on all imports, which President Trump says protects American workers. China, on the other hand, suspends its non-tariff measures like export bans on critical minerals and keeps the 10% tariff. Now, both sides agreed to, keep talking over the next 90 days to work toward a more wholesome agreement. But the catch is tariffs are still higher than before April 2nd, and the US rate of 30% is triple China's 10%, right? Plus, President Trump's sector-specific tariffs on cars, steel, and aluminum, they're still staying in place. So is this really a de-escalation, or just a pause until the next round? I mean, from the US perspective, this deal looks like a tactical retreat, honestly. A lot of YouTubers are, saying how, President Trump caved, he blinked, all those different types of things. These tariffs were meant to force China to come to the table, and they did, right? China's economy was hurting with estimates of, 16 million jobs at risk and sluggish property sector. But there were more reports about, Chinese exports increasing, with all this stuff going down. So they were still kind of making a lot of money, but they still had their own issues because we were obviously as well feeling the heat too, right? Inflation, was just circling around, and a lot of consumers were staring at a lot of price hikes, right? And President Trump's team, he realized, an all-out trade war is really unsustainable, right? The person who was talking in the video, Treasury Secretary Bessent, he even admitted that neither side wants a decoupling of their economies. Decoupling meaning unlinking from each other. So that's essentially a shift from President Trump's early rhetoric about isolating China. Now, looking at China's side, Beijing is trying to play it cool, but this probably left a real bad taste in their mouth. China has been painted as the bad guy with, President Trump, pushing them into retaliating and, hitting harder. And it's just interesting because, a lot of Chinese analysts, they're calling this deal, a great victory, for standing firm. But a lot of other Chinese analysts are probably saying, they're probably frustrated with what the U.S. is doing because it looks like bullying. And China's concessions, like suspending mineral export bans, I mean, it shows that they're willing to play ball, but they're not backing down completely, right? They've exempted some U.S. imports like semiconductors and pharmaceuticals from tariffs, which means they want to keep trade flowing. But the higher U.S. tariffs and President Trump's, fentanyl accusations sting, it's going to hurt China because it sees itself as a victim, right? They see themselves as a victim of unilateral U.S. aggression, right? So at that point, why would China want to even keep working with the U.S. after all this, right? That's my big question, because economies need stability, right? China's GDP growth is projected at just 4% for 2025, which is below their 2025 target. And I mean, excuse me, it's below their 5% target, which is, they're expected to hit 5%, but, it's projected to be just 4% now. And a prolonged trade war could obviously tank some of their markets, right? The U.S. is their third largest trading partner, buying about 440 billion in goods. That was last year. Now, losing that market could be catastrophic. Second, China's pushing a narrative of mutual respect and global cooperation, right? So by staying at the table, they position themselves at the reasonable party, especially as the court, you know, as they try to like move around and find other countries that they can work with, like Brazil and Australia, to fill gaps that's left by these U.S. tariffs, right? And then there's the fentanyl issue. China's engagement on it, during like different talks suggests they see it as leverage to, smooth out all these tensions. But we can't make any mistakes, right? China's pride probably took a hit, and they're likely going to be more cautious, dealing with the United States because we've been, flip-flopping essentially. And we got to talk about the push for like factories and manufacturing jobs coming back to America. It's worked to some extent. Like companies like Apple and Tesla have explored moving supply chains to places like Vietnam or come back here. But, obviously this 90-day deal could probably complicate things, because lower tariffs reduce the pressure on companies to leave China, and the 90-day pause gives them, a breather to delay more big moves, right? And China's still a manufacturing powerhouse with cheap labor and infrastructure that US cannot match or create overnight. Now, if tariffs are going to stay at 30% long term, it might not be enough to force a mass exodus of factories from China back to the United States, especially since, China's offering incentives to keep their business there, right? I mean, 90 days, the clock is ticking, and both sides have a lot to prove. The U.S. were showing that we can negotiate without resorting to tariffs every time. For China, it's all about balancing cooperation with protecting their dignity as well as their economic interests. And we just have to pay attention to see what's going on, man. But I'll try to keep you guys updated as much as I can. It's a new week. Thankful that we're here in this new week. We got some good news. The stock market rallied. I hope people were able to make some money. But obviously, it's a big moment. It's fragile, and both sides have reasons to be skeptical. But let me know what you guys think. Can China, can US, can we keep the peace, or are we just delaying the inevitable? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that like button if you appreciate this video. Share this video with someone who might see some value in it. And subscribe. We're on our way to 2,000 subscribers, man. A lot of people watch these videos, but they're not subscribing. Go ahead and subscribe. And never, ever forget, it's you and I verse. Information, application, execution. I'll try to keep you guys updated as much as I can on the U.S. trade war, just so, I can help you guys be informed as much as you can about, how to keep as much money in your pocket with all these different things going on. Until next time, peace.